Okay, let's go ahead and talk about foreign affairs. There's a lot of stuff that happened in the last couple of days.
Yeah,
Start
indeed.
with China. So the fallout from the Pelosi trip continues. We brought you guys the news that on Thursday, the military exercises by China in the not around Taiwan by shooting missiles into the water there in a pretty provocative move. In addition, missiles falling into the Japanese exclusive economic zone, causing a lot of consternation in Asia on the military front. But some of the fallout on the military side between the U.S. and China is especially troubling. Let's go ahead and put this on the screen. So beyond testing in the Taiwan defense zone, Beijing has now both sanctioned Nancy Pelosi, which that doesn't seem to matter as much, but more so is cutting off all talks between the U.S. military and the Chinese military. Now, one of the most important lessons that we learned from the Cold War was to have that ability in order to speak directly, not only leader to leader, but to have military to military discussion at all times. In the military business, it's called deconfliction. So what we would have is to avoid any military air collisions and just military notification, we would say, hey, just so you know, we will be having an exercise in X region, just so you're aware, your Air Force and more. If they choose to, come around us at that time, that's on you, but it minimizes the chances of some sort of accidental confrontation. And so I mentioned this in our last show, but this only underscores why I think this is so important. Let's go ahead and put this next one up there on the screen, which is that because of this trip, China is actually now expanding its military drills, both in the airspace, in the Taiwan defense zone, in the maritime version, in the missile tests, obviously, at the very same time that they go ahead and cut off our military communications, which again are now reportedly at the highest level, go to the third one please, that the top of the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense, tried to call the People's Liberation Army and was rebuffed, Krystal. His answer, his call, multiple calls were ignored at all levels of the chain of command by the People's Liberation Army while this was happening. I just want to remind everyone, this all happened right before 9/11. It was called the Hainan Island Incident. I mentioned it a little bit in the last show, got overshadowed by 9/11. Basically, we had I forget exactly what it was, a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft that was flying, I think it was in the South China Sea. And a Chinese aircraft, he came and he was being very aggressive. Anyway, by the way, the facts are very disputed by China, but I'm just telling you the U.S. side. So the Chinese aircraft basically collides with this. It gets sawed in half. The pilot dies. The aircraft is very badly damaged. It's forced to land on Hainan Island, which is a Chinese military island. So they land there, and now all of a sudden we're in the middle of a full-fledged diplomatic crisis. We have like 20 guys, pilots and more, who are sitting in China who are basically blaming us. They say it's our fault for both spying on them and then for colliding with this aircraft. They said it was our fault, not their pilot's fault. It required a full-fledged diplomatic crisis by the Bush administration, where actually we had to come to some sort of fake declaration where the soldiers were put on camera and had to sign a statement declaring that it was their fault just to get them the hell out of there. And once we eventually did, they were like, no, actually we didn't do anything. Anyway, that was 2001. That was a very different China. Yes. That was at a unipolar moment of the United States. Yes. And they still were very aggressive and held our guys hostage, quasi-hostage for a little while. Well, what has come out of that since the lesson is we need to have communication with the PLA to make sure that we don't have any of these mid-air collisions, mid-ship collisions, any sort of aggressive behavior in the China Seas, because these types of things can escalate to a much bigger military confrontation and diplomatic crisis. Think about Francis Gary Peters in the Soviet Union. We want to avoid these types of situations. Look at Brittany Griner right now. We want to avoid this stuff at all costs. And so for them to cut off military communication with us over this visit, it's dangerous. And look, I'm not a China appeaser. I think anybody who's watched me for years would know that. I have no problem, quote unquote, standing up to them. My problem with the Pelosi trip, as we repeated over and over again, there was no strategy behind it. She just simply decided to go without any of the advice of the military did not want her to go, specifically for this reason. The Biden administration didn't want her to go. President Biden ultimately didn't feel like he had what it took in order to basically just say, no, you can't go.
Yeah.
And then she goes over there for no discernible reason and has now ignited not only a diplomatic crisis with China, but now having military ramifications. I mean, who knows when they're going to pick up the phone again? These are important. Another thing that we didn't actually cut here, but we had to cancel one of our nuclear missile tests in order to just say like, hey, don't worry about it. It's all good. You know, we had a scheduled Minuteman II nuclear missile test that was going to take place out in California. And part of the reason that it was canceled was because the Pentagon chief literally can't get in touch with the PLA to try and tell them like, hey, it's got nothing to do with you. So they just went ahead and canceled the test. So we have all kinds of downstream ramifications now that have happened as a result of this trip. And the only question is like, okay, was it worth it? Like, what exactly was accomplished by this trip?
What did you gain? Congratulations. Right. Like, you showed that we're strong. Right. Like, it's so silly. It is really just, it was an absolutely reckless and foolish move on her part. And the fact that it was so broadly supported by both parties also tells you a lot about where the foreign policy consensus in the United States Congress is. And it's not just that they've ghosted our defense secretary and are not communicating directly military to military. They also have said they are going to stop cooperating in 8 different key areas, some of them that supposedly Nancy Pelosi cares a lot about, including climate change. So a few of those are not only defense, but narcotics control, transnational crime, and climate change. So listen, the other power in these scenarios always has moves that they can make as well. And I also think it's very illustrative of the way that the U.S. sort of approaches foreign policy in general, because yeah, ultimately, like, China is very responsible for how they decide to respond, and the fact that they're deciding to go, you know, over the top with these war games of the sort that we haven't seen since the 90s, and that they're deciding to sort of sanction Taiwan in these specific ways. They also decided to directly sanction Nancy Pelosi. I'm not going to cry about that one. And to, you know, decide not to cooperate in these 8 key areas. Of course, they ultimately are the ones that made the decision, but we can't act like we're blameless here. Like, this wasn't a predictable outcome from her deciding to go when they were very clear in saying, this is not acceptable to us. Like, this is a red line. This is screwing up what you've said you're committed to over decades and decades and decades. We don't like it, and we did it anyway. So one thing that I have become very concerned about in thinking about this, and there's actually a great interview with Lau Goldstein, who's the director of Asia engagement at Defense Priorities, that's in Jacobin Magazine right now, is I really don't know that, well, I do know the media is not doing a good job of laying out just how risky this ultimately is, and what a precarious moment we're in right now, locked in this proxy war with Russia. So we're already thumbing our nose at one great power in terms of Russia, and directly saying we want to defeat them on the battlefield, and continuing to send billions of dollars in weapon shipments, adding countries to NATO, all of those things. So we're already doing that. And now we're basically picking a fight and sort of provoking another great power that is, you know, has way more at stake in Taiwan and cares way more about Taiwan than we ever will.
What I like about what you're saying, too, is, you know, both the hawks and the doves agree. They're like, this is a lot more dangerous. You know, we've had Bridge Colby on the show. He's a mega hawk on Taiwan. And what will he tell you? He's actually very against a lot of our Ukraine intervention, specifically for this reason. He's like, look, I am only concerned about what's happening in the Asia Pacific. I do not believe that our military is ready for it. The doves will tell you the same thing. There is like a horseshoe theory going on where everybody, I think, can at least agree. I mean, this is really my orientation, which is that I think that focusing all of our problems on the old world while we basically ignore 50% of the world GDP out in the middle of Asia. When I see the cutoff of communication between us and China, I've spoken about it with Russia. It's not even close to the same level of stakes. And that's why the media does a terrible job of communicating what the closure of the Taiwan Strait would mean, what closure of the Straits of Malacca would mean, what the fall of Taiwan would mean for the United States. Like, these are astronomical. Like, you think it's bad to pay $1.50 more per gas a gallon? Like, imagine not being able to buy any consumer electronics. Imagine having no more cars. Like, imagine literally, I mean, also, Russia is, you know, you called it a great power. I mean, it's 1/10 probably the military and economic strength of the Chinese.
But like, we're literally just casually risking nuclear confrontation with 2 countries, significant countries right now. That's insane. I mean, you just look at the fact that you're like, what in the world are you thinking doing this? And yes, Pelosi maybe decided to do this on her own, but it is a major failure and a huge humiliation, honestly, for Biden. If he didn't want her to go and he couldn't bother to get on the phone with her and say, do what he needed to do and say what he needed to say to get her to not go, this has completely scrambled their policy. To your point about the Cold War, listen, I have a million complaints about the way that we operated during the Cold War, but there was a strategy. There was thought. There was a visceral understanding among the public and among our leaders of what the stakes were, what the risks were. There was intentional communication. There were intentional, ultimately, agreements that were come to try to avert the worst of the worst potential disasters. Now, I just feel like we're just sort of bumbling around this thing casually, you know, oh, I feel like going to Taiwan. Let me do that. It's the end of my career. Let me go there. There seems to be no intentional strategy or real understanding of what the stakes and what the risks are, and that scares the hell out of me.
It should scare you. It's actually, you know, Marshall and I are very divergent often, and we were talking about this recently on the realignment, and he was like, you know, even, you know, from a more hawkish perspective, the biggest problem that we have both, you know, shared with the trip is around exactly what's happening here with the lack of strategy, and Pelosi's just ad hoc going. Think about the days of the Soviet Union. Would Tip O'Neill ever defy Ronald Reagan and just go to the Soviet? Never. It would never happen.
Right. Imagine that.
Because what happened is that 1948 onward, George Kennan writes NSC 68, laying out the strategy of containment. This becomes the guiding foreign policy of the United States up until 1991. Everybody had their varying degrees on containment. Obviously, Vietnam was a disaster. Then, you know, you had like détente, then you had rollback, all of these different things, but they were within the same framework. We have no framework of prioritization.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.